Hi there, I'm Katie, the president of the Brewston Brennanville Volunteer Fire Department Auxiliary, and I am joined again today with Chief Adam Hoffman. Thanks again for joining us.
Welcome back.
And Adam and I are coming off of a very long week.
Indeed.
We had our Good Neighbor Days community festival, and it landed up raining on the big day, so that was nice. So we're trying to pull it together here to talk today a little bit about ethics. Ethics and leadership particularly, because the influence, power, and control that comes with leadership deserves the special attention of our followers, that we don't abuse that.
Absolutely. I think we kind of broached the subject last week with that, kind of covenant between leaders and followers, right? That duty,
That agreement.
back and forth
Contract.
between the two. Absolutely.
That's
Contract
really
would be a good way to think of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think this is a nice continuation of that theme of the responsibilities of the leader. And last week we talked a little bit about the responsibilities of the follower, but I think we're going to talk a little more on the ethics side today, right?
We are. So, my first question for you, Adam, is do you remember ethics ever being an explicit part of any of your fire officer classes? Fire Officer 1 or 2 or any of those? Do you remember anything explicitly?
Leadership ethics, no. Ethics of, fiduciary ethics, if you look at patient care ethics, certainly part of all of those, but leadership ethics specifically, no, I don't
Interesting.
remember
Okay,
having any
so
part of that.
I was thinking about this today before our talk, and the ethics that we have to consider here are more than just leadership ethics, because we also have to kind of, like you said, patient ethics, healthcare, also business ethics, because we're trying to operate a business here. And so it's a little bit more complicated, I think, because there's facets of all those things kind of happening simultaneously. And you don't remember anything explicitly, like there was no piece of like I know when in med school there's like specifically an ethics piece of a class. There was no.
There may have been a small
I know that was
quip
a while
about
ago
it,
for
but
you.
I no, there
Sure.
wasn't anything
Nothing that
specific.
you remembered, right?
Now, and that could be that it just wasn't a
Implicit.
memorable topic in our
Sure.
course.
Or
I'm
could
not
have been
saying that it
implicit, sure.
wasn't in there, because I imagine I'm sure there's at least a subchapter
Sure,
or
no,
something
I'm
in there
sure.
about ethics, but it certainly wasn't poignant enough for me to recall
Right.
it 10 years later.
Yeah, I was curious if that was something that they maybe hammered home, or maybe it's something they should hammer home. I don't know.
I think it probably could be definitely at least more explicitly explained and thought about than it has been.
Right. So I was thinking about too the different styles that we've talked about over the last several weeks. Do you think that any of the styles that we talked about are more ethical than others?
I don't know that they're inherently more ethical. I think some probably are easier or
Higher on the moral pillar?
maybe higher in some aspects of the moral pillar, right? Servant leadership tends to come to mind, right? That's a very
Right.
it's maybe a little more natural to be ethical when you're approaching things as a servant.
Sure.
and as a follower first, and then as a servant first. It's probably tends to encourage maybe more ethical behavior, but I don't think that any of them are ethical or unethical at their nature.
No, they're not. I don't think so either. And as I thought about it, I was thinking like servant leadership and spiritual leadership, obviously very moral. Maybe transformational leadership being more higher on the ethical, just like that's kind of like what's centered, everything else is centered kind of around that, versus things like leader-member exchange, where it's really more focused on maybe communication and loyalty, and those types of things are more centered.
Well, let's keep in mind, right, that Hitler was a transformational leader. So I don't know that we can tie those specifically to an ethic concern.
Although, so this is really an interesting. I don't want to get into this. Obviously, I don't want to get into Hitler, but I had a really interesting thought. The very first article that I read when I started investigating leadership was talking kind of about how to deal with Hitler in leadership, and I thought to myself, like, yes, obviously Hitler was immoral. That's very obvious, but how are we defining moral? Because perhaps he was moral in his mind with his morals.
Sure.
They weren't mainstream contemporary morals.
Sure.
And I don't want to get into the Hitler, obviously, but that's
this
just an
is one of the
interesting thought I
interesting
had.
things I think about the Nuremberg trials, that post World War II, was that there was no consensus in the world that even such a court or such trials could take place. There was no overarching law necessarily that the Germans violated. Now we all, I think, agree that that was immoral, right? But legally speaking, there was no standard, right? Well, there was no standard, right, for human atrocity. So there was no legal precedent for the Nuremberg trials, and there was some concern that they would fall apart. And I think what we've learned from that is that there are certain human moral truths. And I think that was, certainly the prosecutions were important, but I think even more importantly, we established as a species that there are some things as humans that are beyond the pale, that are too far. And that, I think, is interesting, because then it also, if you define something as bad, it means that its inverse must also be true, that there must be moral good. There must be ethical behavior on the other side. You can't have one without the other, right? So you can't have darkness without light. And so if with that, you also define then that there is a standard or a mode of being that is good or ethical, that transcends culture, continent, any of those things.
Right, and I thought that was really interesting too, to think about that time period. So we kind of broached that in the late 40s, probably, when we were looking at those trials.
40s, early 50s.
And then
even up through the 60s and 70s, as they were finding Nazis later on.
I'm looking at that time period, it seems like there was a lot of unknowns with ethics, because also, like, if you think about during the 40s, 50s, 60s, that's when we were putting women in insane asylums for having a menstrual period. You know what I mean? Like, or postpartum depression or things like that. And you see kind of after, like, we have to experience those things. And also a lot of research ethics came from the 60s, where we were doing kind of atrocious research habits for the sake of science. And then we were like, well, we can't do that.
Right.
Like, that's really bad. And it just took, and it's interesting because that's pretty recent in history that all of that occurred. I mean, less than 100 years ago.
I agree. And I think part of what you see in that your historical examples is that as we learn more, as we become more educated, we do more research, we actually understand more and should become more ethical. We put women in insane asylums because we didn't know what else to do. We didn't understand it. We didn't know what else to do. And we obviously recognize that now is wrong, but in the time, that's a very different thing. So,
let's scope back. I looked into the when I started reading the article based on ethics for this week, just based on the Nordhaus text, they talked about someone named Kohlberg and his theory on ethics and how someone builds ethics within. Obviously, we think that's probably an intrinsic thing. And there's a pre-conventional ethics, which happens in children. That's when they learn that, children and adolescents. And then there's a conventional, which is what most adults have and, later adolescents have. And then there's also a post-convention, which is kind of like this higher level of moral that actually the text says that not everyone achieves in their lifetime.
Sure. Right. Yeah, so I would see that maybe as like transcendence, as the Dalai Lama might say. But yeah, and I think that's true. I think there are definitely levels, if you will, of ethics, of your understanding and of your behavior. And those two things, I think, are probably separate pillars as we see. And I think you build that from childhood, right? And you start, any parent can tell you that you can't scold a 2-year-old for things you would scold a 5-year-old for, because they just don't have the same level of understanding, right? And that's probably true throughout our lives, where as we grow, hopefully, if we're attuned and conscious and explicit about wanting to learn these things, we grow our ethical knowledge and behavior. But I think our teaching and recognition of that is sorely lacking in our society. When was the last time you ever heard someone complimented for being ethical?
Well, I mean,
Right.
you hear lots of things about when something's unethical.
Right, but the inverse of that is not
and
nearly the
praise for
same.
that, sure, that's
Correct.
true.
Right.
So going back to that kind of conventional versus post-conventional, do you think that it's difficult? Let's say that your leader. What if your leaders and your followers are different on that scale? I mean, naturally we're thinking like your leader would be a post-conventional ethical person who's got this like great skill, and then now the followers may be there, they might be conventional, regular ethical standards for adults. But what if the opposite were true? What if your leader was conventional with their ethics, and then you had followers who were post-conventional, who had like these maybe transcendent thoughts?
Well, I certainly think that can be true, right? I think it's ethical competence is probably a form of competence like any other. And you certainly can have, so in the past, in our fire department, we've had clergy members as firemen, or that have helped us out either here or whatever. Certainly there are different differing age groups here.
Absolutely.
And so you would expect, well, and you have, senior citizens here. So you have, certainly different age groups. And you would expect that a lot of the, senior citizens with a wellspring of life experience would have, at least theoretically, and I can think of some specific examples, have a better ethical frame.
Sorry,
And
we're getting like
yeah, my gosh, yeah, there's a couple flies in here. So, but I think, but I don't know that the leader has to be the wellspring from which all ethics derive. There certainly is a minimum competence and minimum ethical competence that the leader has to exhibit. But they don't have to be, we talked about this, the same thing with our skills and our knowledge from a tactical standpoint. I can't be, just because I wear the white helmet doesn't mean that I can be or should be the fountain of all ideas and truth, right? I don't know everything, and I'm wrong consistently. I told my guys last night, I said, 90% of your job is just telling me why I'm stupid. And they said, yeah, and we're busy. And I said, yeah, I know you are. And so
funny.
And so that's true. And so just like anything else,
that was so funny.
I can't be the wellspring of all things ethical, and I can't be the wellsprings of all things tactical either.
And so, can I just say that I love that your officers are able to say that to you, and you laugh, and they also laugh, and then it's like fine, like nobody gets like upset that that's the way it is. Like, they're just cool with it. Like you're cool with it, they're
absolutely.
Cool with
it. One of the things, and I think maybe this is somewhat an ethical concern. Your leader has to understand their shortcomings and have a bit of humility, because if they don't, it is dangerous. It is absolutely, it is dangerous. And so, we're poking fun and we're jesting, but they have zero qualms with telling me that like what I'm suggesting is dumb, and I appreciate that, because I try to intentionally foster that, because I have to have people around me that are going to tell me the truth, because I can't always be right.
And we've echoed this, I think, through every single episode. And even the last episode, I think we discussed a little bit about how you have to create that environment of, it might be 2 episodes ago, psychological safety, so that there's open dialogue and members can come to you with their concerns, because you can't have eyes on everything. You have to kind of look from the balcony, as they say.
Yeah.
And so I think that just the fact that you guys are able to like have those little haha moments, or that just speaks to the psychological safety that and that the
absolutely
firehouse
our psychological
has.
safety and our team environment, that we all understand that this is not run by one person. This is not that it will not succeed if it's just me. We all know that. Right. And me, most, maybe even more so than everyone else, I realize that, I am not the fire department, right? I am just one person in the fire department.
Right. So I also wanted to touch a little bit on, you've said to me in the past that, and I don't know if this falls under ethics, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. So you've said to me in the past, especially with EMS, but also with fire, how important it is to dress the way that you want to be perceived when it comes to trust, conduct, character. Because you want to be emulating that to strangers when you come into their homes on the worst day.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's kind of I think that's an ethical thing. It feels kind of like an ethical thing. I'm not sure if I'm tying that into the wrong subject.
Well, I don't know that. Yeah, it is, and I think
if you talk about it from a conduct and character perspective,
Right.
with ethics being the pinnacle of conduct and character.
Yeah, I think
then
that's true.
Not necessarily uniform, but just having pride in how you look.
Well, uniform is one piece of that, right?
Identifiable, the way you act,
Right,
behaviors.
the way you speak, and I used to say that you know, paramedics or firemen are first impression masters. They master the first impression because you have just a few seconds to gain the trust of the public. Now, there's
Or
an
lose it.
or lose it, and there's an implicit piece there too that the fire service over the last 250 years has built up a tradition of trust and excellence that the public relies on it, and so we come in with some baseline of trust, and there is an ethical piece of that, of maintaining that
Right.
as well, right?
Yeah.
And
No,
earning
that is part of
and
it.
maintaining that trust. But all those things, it is, in my opinion, unethical to show up to an emergency unprepared, ill-equipped, without the right tools, knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? And that's unethical. That's a violation of the trust that the community places in us, right? And so uniforms can be a part of that. We're a volunteer fire department, so we don't have, we're 2 a.m. when you're coming from your own house. So the odds of anybody showing up in a uniform are essentially
You
zero.
guys go to bunker gear anyway, so it
Right.
doesn't really matter how you show up to the firehouse.
Right, and
necessarily.
and so you'll see guys come rolling in the firehouse at 2:30 in the morning and all kinds of nonsense, right? And PJs and flip flops and whatever they rolled out of bed in, right? But appearance is a piece of that, of projecting to the public your professionalism, and I think as the more ethical you become, the more your appearance matters, not in a vain way. Right. And so I don't make sure my boots are clean and shined and my uniform shirt is pressed because I care how I look.
Right.
Clearly that's not,
You care how Mima thinks about you.
but I do care how grandma thinks about me. And I want to project confidence, and that confidence from myself brings a lot of calm to the environment. So I do think that, because you can tell, I think we're all innately in tune to, who is good and who is not good, right? We make those snap judgments and honestly, we're pretty correct most of the time.
Right.
And so taking a little pride in your appearance and being put together and speaking clearly and showing up with a calm confidence, not a cocky attitude, but a confident behavior, brings some calm and some peace of mind to the people we're coming to help. And so I think that's all. I think it is at least partly an ethical concern. Partly for us, it's a practical concern too, right? Because we can't have everybody running around screaming and yelling, and because we need to bring that calm so that we can function. And if you can't tell me what's wrong, then I can't help, right? So bringing that does have a practical consideration, but I think it is an ethical consideration because a lot of these emergencies are there's a very different, what most firemen or paramedics think is emergency that's very different than what the average public thinks.
Sure.
And so when we show up and your husband's sugar's 20, to us, that's not a big deal. It's something we can fix. It's something that we'll have right and be good to go in just a few minutes. And we're not honestly we're not going to be that panicked about it. So us showing up with some calm will help everybody in the family bring that down, realize, hey, we've got this under control and we're going to fix it. Right.
So I was trying to rack my brain of some example I could give of great ethics or poor ethics, and I just couldn't. But so a good example, just like you said, would it be unethical to treat, and when I say treat, I think it's more like behavioral, not necessarily medical, someone whose husband is sugar's 20 as that's not a thing. Okay.
Oh yeah, that would certainly be unethical, right? You have to take the family's concerns seriously, but that doesn't mean that taking them seriously and letting that break your confidence or calm are different things.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I'd like to touch on a little bit is that ethics is not synonymous with kindness.
Interesting.
So I do want to talk about that from a leadership perspective. So, and what I mean by that is you can't, certainly a lot of times they run together, but it is unethical as a leader for you to not address when your people mess up or to not address problems
That is a good
in your organization, right? So a lot of people will get too concerned with, I have to be nice
Right.
instead of I have to be ethical. And
Right. That's
it's
so
way
true.
more important to be ethical than it is to be nice. Now, the way you say things matters. And I'm not saying that you need to go and be a jerk, but if you're not addressing problems in your organization or problem individuals in your organization, that's an ethical violation
It
for you
absolutely
as a
is.
leader, right? And we've all experienced that at some level: toxic coworkers or a toxic, boss or leadership, whatever. And one of those things, one of those ethical concerns for me is you have to address those, both for the health of the organization, but from an ethical standpoint, because you can't allow people to continue to do the wrong things with your approval, because that's the same thing as you endorsing that toxic or bad behavior or whatever the problem was.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. I hadn't really considered. Right, we had our bay doors open yesterday, and I'm getting eaten out by flies.
You're dive bombed over
I'm
there.
getting dive bombed.
Dive bomb.
Yeah, so I think, did you have anything else that you wanted to add with that before I?
No, I didn't want to make that distinction between niceness
Absolutely.
and ethical behavior. And a lot of times they run together. And certainly, even when you're addressing problems, you should still be kind to the point that you can be kind. But it is unethical to leave things unsaid
Right. So I
that
think
need to be
I
said.
think that some of the things that at least the themes I'm gathering here is how I'm interpreting this is professionalism and ethics aren't necessarily the same thing, but they are seemingly tied pretty.
They
closely
certainly
together.
run together. Yeah.
And so, like the whole dress thing,
And I
the whole
think-
addressing people professionally thing, but like I think anything that's ethical, it's hard. I mean, ethics, things that when you have a concern of ethics, it's usually a difficult conversation.
Yeah. No, it almost always is, right?
I've never had like
And
a dilemma.
leaders aren't super trained, or aren't most leaders, and I guess I can speak to the fire service industry
Right.
the most, aren't trained well enough or specifically in ethics. I would imagine that most fire service leaders couldn't tell me the difference between beneficence and non-malfeasance and justice, right? And so that having ethical concerns often ends up as, well, I just didn't like this thing this person did. But they can't necessarily explain why they didn't
Right.
like that, right?
And
Like
that's that
you violated this patient's
conventional-
autonomy, right? That's an ethical autonomy,
and
right?
maybe that's
And
that
or
conventional-
I just didn't like that, and it comes off a lot of times when leaders have ethical concerns with their followers. I think sometimes they have a hard time explaining that
But do you
because they
think-
don't have the right
Well, yeah,
tools
but
and
do you
terms.
think that maybe is that post-conventional approach? Is just
Could be.
as being
Mhm.
able to identify that and share that with someone who maybe doesn't speak that language. It's just at the conventional level. They
Maybe.
understand why something was bad, but they can't really articulate what
Mhm.
it was within that's in that moral.
In that moral roots that would be
Right.
expressing that,
Yeah, and that could
which
be
might be
right.
post-conventional.
I'm trying to make sense of that.
Yeah, and I don't know how to define what is post-conventional, right? And the more you learn about ethics, I guess the more you move to what would be post-conventional. But I think that's a spectrum. I don't know that. I think any
Sure.
line that you draw is probably arbitrary, right?
Sure.
Like, yeah, okay, I'm somewhere between, the local pastor and the Dalai Lama. I don't know. It's hard to draw a line and place that. No, I'm probably just north of a politician, but
No.
but I think you have that's probably a spectrum, right? And there's
Sure.
probably no end to that
Just like
learning,
everything else we've talked
right?
about.
There's probably no end to that learning.
Sure. So, did you have anything else that you wanted to add about ethics that you were thinking about today?
No, I don't think.
So, I wanted to end this episode with one interesting fun fact. So, I was on a podcast a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked you an interesting question about how you wanted to be remembered. Is that was that the correct question?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think they asked a question
Such as, like, when you're done being chief and you've retired from the fire service, how do you want to be remembered? What words would you use? What
Yeah,
would
I
words
stumbled
would
over
you
that a little bit.
use?
I was actually kind of sounded pretty bad on that one because I wasn't prepared for that question, and
That's
I
such
didn't.
a big question.
It is a big question,
And
right?
and do you remember exactly what you
So
said?
so it took me a couple of minutes to come up with the right words, but eventually I did come up with the right words, and it was character, competence, and compassion. I think were the three things that I would most want somebody to, write in my eulogy, probably. Right? Character, competence, and compassion.
Right. And so those are, to me, three very ethical words.
Yeah. Well, I think anytime you're talking about somebody's eulogy, they're looking to, they care a lot more about how people see them ethically. Man,
Yeah.
I'm way better off
All right.
over here than you are.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I didn't shower today or something. So yeah, I'm just gonna leave it with that.
If you guys have any questions or if there's any other topics that you want to discuss regarding the fire industry, volunteer fire industry, or auxiliary, we would be happy to move forward. I think this is our last official podcast regarding leadership, although
At
we
least for
may
now, yeah.
we may come up with some new topics. But I finished reading the Nordhaus book. Actually, I'll show you the book just in case you're interested in reading it. It's really well defined and very clear. I'm not sponsored or anything by this. I just wanted to show you that book. So if you're ever interested, it's very easy to read and has lots of examples in it. And that was kind of the basis of all of our discussions for these podcasts. So, but if you have anything you want to talk about, whether it's leadership related or not, we're happy to talk about business stuff or, community based stuff, anything like that. I can't talk about patient care, but Adam can. But yeah, so let us know in the comments if you're interested in any of that, and we will hopefully talk to you all soon.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks so much for your time, everyone.